In this series of videos, we're going to be looking at the structure and mechanism about how the lungs are used to inhale and exhale air, starting first with the basic structure of the lungs and the muscle groups that control them in this video. So the lungs are actually not a single piece each. Each of the lungs is made up of separate pieces, what we call lobes. We can see on the right lung, yes, this is on the right side of the body, even though it is on the left-hand side of this diagram. This right lung here, we can see has 1, 2, 3 separate lobes, while the left-hand lung only has 2. Now, this technically means that the right lung is actually slightly larger than the left lung, and that's because of the organ that sits right here and takes up more space on the left-hand side of the body, and that, of course, is the heart. Now, the lungs are actually not made of a single type of cells either. Both of the lungs are surrounded by a protective layer outside of the actual lung tissue, which is what we call the pleura, or more commonly known as the pleural membrane, that number one acts as a layer of physical protection to protect the actual centers of gas exchange within the lungs, but also exists to keep the lungs watertight, because we don't want large sources of water from the rest of the body from draining into the lungs, because that would trigger drowning. Now, because the lungs actually relax and contract, meaning that they actually change volume every time that you breathe, we also need a special liquid, which is what we call pleural fluid, which again is trapped between the pleural layer on the outside and the actual lung tissue on the inside, and this serves the same function that water does pretty much everywhere else in the body, in order to keep the lungs lubricated, in order to reduce any damage that is caused by friction every time that you breathe. So that deals with the exterior structure of the lungs that allows them to expand and contract. At the second half of this video, we're going to introduce the two groups of muscles that are used to either contract the lungs when you exhale or to expand the lungs when you inhale. And the exact mechanism of this will be looked at in the following video. For now, consider this an introduction to the two groups of muscles. So the first group of muscles are not actually on the lungs themselves, but rather outside of the lungs in between your ribs. And these are what we call your respiratory intercostal muscles. So inter obviously is a prefix that means between, and we can infer that costal in this context refers to ribs. And the way that these work, even though it's a little bit difficult to see, your ribs can actually expand outward farther away from your body, and when the intercostal muscles contract, that actually causes the muscular layer in between the ribs to push outward and actually pull the lungs outward away from your body core. And if you actually put your hands on your chest and feel yourself inhale, you will feel that your rib cage actually pushes away from your body, causing the lungs to actually expand outward away from your body core. Now, when you exhale, you can feel your rib cage coming closer to your body when the intercostal muscles relax, which actually brings your ribs closer together, therefore causing your lungs to come back inward closer to your body's core. So the result of intercostal muscle contraction is that the lung volume actually expands forward and outward, causing more space to become available inside of the lungs. And when the intercostal muscles relax during the exhale, it causes the lung volume to decrease back to its original size. Now, the primary muscle that regulates the rate of breathing as well as the depth of breathing is a muscle that we call the diaphragm, which is found right below the lungs. So the diaphragm is this muscle down here, which is actually shaped like a semicircle when it is in a kind of neutral, not exhaling and not inhaling position. And we can see that the way that the diaphragm works is that the diaphragm is connected to the bottom of each of the lungs here, and as the diaphragm moves, it causes the lungs to be pulled downward or upward depending on what the diaphragm does. So when the diaphragm is in the relaxed position, it has this semicircular position, but when the diaphragm actually contracts during the inhale, the diaphragm is actually pulled down and flattens out to a structure like this, which causes the lungs to be pulled down. Now, as the lungs are pulled down, this expands their vertical volume, allowing the lungs to accommodate more air. But when the diaphragm relaxes during the exhale, the diaphragm pushes back up to the relaxed position, therefore squeezing the carbon dioxide that is in the lungs out of the lungs and pushing that air out when the lungs are pushed back up on the exhale. So if you didn't get the details about how the contraction and relaxation of the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm work, don't worry, because that's the entire focus of the next video in this series. The final part that we can mention here is the secondary function of the diaphragm, which actually, in addition to regulating the size of the lungs during breathing, actually acts as a physical barrier separating the two largest internal cavities from the body from each other. So the lungs and the heart, which actually would be here if it were shown, are what we call your thoracic or your thoracic cavity that contain the most important organs of your cardiovascular system, your heart and your lungs, and everything below the diaphragm is what we call, if I can actually spell the word correctly, is what we call your abdominal cavity, and this of course is the location where all of the digestive organs are kept. And it's important that the diaphragm segregates the two, because the two functions, the functions of your cardiovascular system and of your digestive system, are distinct from each other, and therefore the diaphragm provides a physical separation between those two organs, allowing, or organ systems, allowing them to operate independently of each other. In the next video, we're going to focus entirely on the control and the mechanism of the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm, and look at how the two sets of muscles work together in order to change lung volume during inhalation and exhalation.